The air in the hallway of the St. Jude's Home for Children always smelled of floor wax and missed opportunities. It was a sharp, clinical scent that seemed to peel away the layers of Leo's hope, one Saturday at a time. Leo sat on the wooden bench, his legs swinging, though they didn't quite reach the floor. His chest felt heavy, as it often did, a dull rhythmic ache that served as a constant reminder of the internal machinery that was failing him. It was a frantic, fluttery sensation, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of bone. He was 10 years old, and he knew the rules of the visiting room better than the Bible verses he was forced to recite on Sundays. The Choose-a-Child events were the most agonizing. They were dressed up as picnics or ice cream socials, but to the children waiting they were auctions. "Posture, Leo," whispered Sister Margaret, passing by. Her hand rested on his shoulder for a brief, fleeting second. Her touch was kind, but it lacked the permanence of a grip. She was a woman of faith, but even she looked at Leo with a pity that tasted like ash. Leo straightened his back, pulling his thin cardigan tighter around his frame. He watched through the glass partition of the recreation hall. Prospective parents moved through the room like shoppers in a boutique. They were looking for sturdy limbs, bright eyes, and the promise of a future that wouldn't require a constant supply of medication or expensive specialists. He saw a couple near the swing set. The woman, elegantly dressed in a cream-colored coat, laughed as a curly-haired boy sprinted past her. Her husband caught the boy and swung him into the air. Leo's heart skipped a beat, a dangerous skipping rhythm that made him dizzy, and he grabbed his chest, pressing his palm flat against the erratic thrum. "Don't look!" A voice hissed beside him. It was Toby, a boy with scabby knees and a permanent scowl. "It just makes the hole in your chest bigger, Leo." "I'm not looking," Leo lied. "You are. You're staring at the lady with the pearls. You want her, don't you?" Leo didn't answer. He watched the woman, Mrs. Gable, as she knelt to tie the curly-haired boy's shoe. She looked so kind. She looked like the kind of person who would read bedtime stories and keep a nightlight on in the hallway. Leo imagined her hand smoothing his hair, but then the memory of the medical disclosure form flashed in his mind. The document that stated in cold black ink that Leo suffered from tetralogy of Fallot. A heart that was structurally wrong, a heart that kept him on the sidelines while other boys played soccer. He watched as Mrs. Gable stood up, her eyes scanning the room. She was looking for a child to complete her picture-perfect life. She walked past the row of boys sitting on the bench. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, thump, 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 flutter, thump. He tried to breathe through his nose, shallow and controlled, just the way the doctor had taught him. "Don't pant, don't look sick. Be invisible but be chosen." Mrs. Gable paused. She stopped directly in front of Leo. For a second the world narrowed down to the distance between her polished boots and his worn-out sneakers. "Hello," she said. Her voice was like velvet. "Hello," Leo whispered. His breath caught a tiny hitch in his throat. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at the chart Sister Margaret held in her hand, a document that hovered just over Leo's head like a death sentence. Her eyes drifted to the slight bluish tint around Leo's lips, a sign of his low oxygen levels. The smile faltered. It wasn't an act of cruelty, he realized, but an act of retreat. She wanted a son to take to the park, not a son to take to the cardiac ward. "He's a very sweet boy," Sister Margaret said softly. "Very intelligent." Mrs. Gable tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "We were looking for someone a bit more energetic. My husband and I, we love to hike. We have such an active lifestyle." Leo felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't that he couldn't hike, it was that he would never be allowed to. He was a fragile piece of porcelain in a world that demanded granite. "I understand," the sister said, her voice dropping to a murmur. Mrs. Gable gave Leo one last, awkward pat on the shoulder. It was a gesture of dismissal, not affection. "I hope he finds a good home." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. She walked back to the curly-haired boy, reached out and took his hand. The door opened, and they stepped out into the bright, blinding sunshine of a world that didn't have room for a boy with a broken heart. Leo watched them go until they were nothing more than dots against the horizon. "Told you," Toby muttered, kicking the base of the bench. Leo didn't cry. Crying increased his heart rate, and increased heart rates led to fainting, and fainting led to the infirmary, and the infirmary was where dreams went to die. He stood up slowly, the blood rushing to his head. "Where are you going?" "To the library," Leo said, his voice steady, though his hands shook. He walked down the dim, long corridor past the empty playrooms and the rows of empty beds. He found his way to the small, dusty bookcase in the corner of the staff lounge, where he knew the discarded medical journals were kept. He pulled out a thick, heavy volume, Principles of Cardiovascular Surgery. He opened it to a page showing a diagram of the human heart. It was a complex, beautiful, terrifying machine. He traced the chambers with his finger, his pulse drumming against his fingertips. Atrium, ventricle, valve, aorta. If he couldn't be the boy they wanted, he would become the man who made hearts whole again. He would learn how to fix the things that everyone else was too afraid to touch. He would study until his eyes burned and his brain was filled with the blueprint of life itself. He looked at his reflection in the glass window of the lounge. He saw a pale, thin boy with dark circles under his eyes and a chest that heaved with every breath. But behind the glass, in the reflection of his own eyes, there was a fire that hadn't been there before. He turned the page. 2 years later, the silence of the orphanage was broken by the sound of a late-night ambulance screaming toward the city hospital. Leo, now 12, sat by the window, watching the strobe of blue and red lights cut through the dark. He didn't know it then, but the patient inside that ambulance was the same woman who had looked at him and seen only a liability. He closed his eyes and practiced his stitching technique on a piece of scrap fabric, his movements fluid and precise. Thump thump. His heart was still beating, and as long as it kept time, he had work to do. The next morning, the head nurse, Mrs. Higgins, walked into the communal room with a grim face. She held a newspaper in her hand, the local headline screaming about a high-speed collision on the interstate. "Leo," she called out, her voice unusually somber. "Come here, dear. You've been reading those medical books again. I have something to show you." Leo set down his scalpel-shaped wooden carving tool and walked toward her. His heart gave that familiar, traitorous flutter, but he pushed it down. He walked with his head high, a small, invisible weight on his shoulders. "There was a terrible accident," she said, pointing to a photograph in the paper. Leo leaned in. His eyes scanned the article, the wreckage, and then the list of names of the injured being rushed to the trauma center, the very hospital where he volunteered on Saturdays, running errands for the surgical residents. His finger stopped on a name. Gable Elena. His breath hitched. The name triggered a memory of pearls, a cream-colored coat, and the smell of expensive perfume. "She's in critical condition," Mrs. Higgins whispered, not knowing the history. "They're saying her heart was punctured by a piece of metal, a freak injury. They're calling for the best thoracic surgeons in the city, but it's a race against time." Leo felt a cold chill run down his spine. He looked out the window at the distant, towering structure of the hospital, rising above the city like a fortress of glass and steel. He knew that building. He knew the layout of its hallways, the location of the oars, and the sound of the monitors. He grabbed his jacket. "Where are you going, Leo?" Mrs. Higgins asked, alarmed. "It's a school day. I have an appointment," Leo said, his voice devoid of a 10-year-old's uncertainty. He didn't wait for her to argue. He walked out the front door of the orphanage, the heavy iron gate clicking shut behind him. He didn't look back at the place that had never felt like home. He walked toward the hospital, his stride long and purposeful, his heart beating in sync with the rhythm of the city. He didn't know if she would survive long enough for him to see her, or if she would even recognize the boy she had discarded. But as he reached the ambulance bay, he saw Gurney being rushed toward the sliding doors. He slipped through the crowd, unnoticed, a shadow in the halls of medicine. He reached the ICU waiting area just as the doors were closing. He stood there, watching the doctors scramble, the lights flickering overhead. He pressed his hand against the glass partition of the recovery wing. "I'm going to be the one who saves you, T," he thought. "Not because you chose me, but because I chose myself suddenly." The monitors inside the room began to shriek, a long, continuous, terrifying tone. A nurse sprinted past him, shouting for a crash cart. Leo gripped the edge of the glass, his eyes wide. The room erupted into chaos. Doctors were shouting, paddles were being grabbed, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and fear. And then everything went still. The surgeon in charge stood back, his shoulders slumping. He turned toward the door, his eyes meeting Leo's through the glass. The surgeon shook his head. Leo felt the floor beneath him tilt. His heart, his treacherous, fragile heart, gave a violent final lurch. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the cold glass. Just as the surgeon grabbed the door handle to push his way out, the orphanage was a place where sound went to die. It was a suffocating silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic taunting thump-thump of Leo's own chest, a jagged, irregular cadence that felt like a bird trapped in a wire cage. 10-year-old Leo sat on the splintered floorboards of the communal library, a room that smelled of damp paper and forgotten childhoods. Through the thin, yellowed curtains, he could hear the muffled laughter of the Choose a Child event happening in the main hall. It was a cruel theater. Families came in their Sunday best, their eyes scanning the children like shoppers inspecting fruit for bruises. Leo had been inspected 4 times today. Each time, the result was the same. The moment a potential parent saw his file, the one labeled congenital cardiac anomaly, the warmth in their eyes would ice over. "He's a beautiful boy, really," he'd heard Mrs. Gable say, her voice dripping with a pity that tasted like bile. She had reached out to stroke his hair, but her hand had stalled mid-air, hesitating as if his skin might be contagious. "But we were looking for someone athletic, someone who could grow up to hold a bat, not a prescription bottle. I'm sorry, dear. We need someone who isn't, well, a liability." Liability. The word had echoed in his ears for hours, bouncing off the peeling wallpaper of the library. He didn't cry. Crying increased his heart rate, and an increased heart rate led to the blue-tinted lips and the dizzy spells that forced him into bed for days. Instead, Leo stared at the shelf in front of him. His eyes landed on a leather-bound volume that looked like it hadn't been touched since the building was erected. Gray's Anatomy. Descriptive and surgical, he stood up, his legs trembling slightly, and pulled the heavy book down. It landed on his lap with a thud that sent a cloud of dust dancing into the sliver of sunlight piercing the room. He opened it. The diagrams were intricate, beautiful, and terrifying. They weren't just drawings, they were blueprints of his own internal prison. He traced the lines of the ventricles, the valves, the branching highways of the pulmonary arteries. He saw the defect, the holes that made his life a countdown. "You're a map," he whispered to the book. His voice was raspy, unused. "Looking for a bedtime story?" Leo jumped, his chest flaring with a sudden, sharp pain. He clutched the book to his ribs, looking up to see Sister Beatrice standing in the doorway. She was a woman of rigid routines and cold tea. She didn't look at him with malice, but with a weary detachment, as if she were merely waiting for his departure from the mortal coil to clear out her registry. "I'm learning," Leo said, his voice steadying. Sister Beatrice frowned, her gaze shifting to the open page. "That is not for children, Leo. It's too heavy. Put it back. You should be in the hall. There's a couple from the city." "They don't want a liability," Leo interrupted, his fingers tightening on the page. "And I don't want to be a broken thing in a display case." The sister paused, her hand hovering near the light switch. "You are what you are, Leo. Acceptance is a grace. Don't Chase ghosts. They aren't ghosts, Leo said, looking down at the illustration of the human heart. It's a machine, and if it's broken, I'm going to learn how to fix it. You are a child, she said softly, but the cruelty was gone, replaced by a devastating pity. You will never hold a scalpel. You will be lucky if you hold your own breath through the winter. She walked away, leaving him in the gathering gloom. Leo didn't put the book back. He lugged it to his narrow cot in the corner of the dormitory, hidden beneath his thin, scratchy blanket. That night, under the cover of darkness, he began his education. He learned about the tetralogy of Fallot, the overriding aorta, the ventricular septal defect, the hypertrophy. He learned that the very thing that was killing him had a name, and if it had a name, it had a boundary. Days turned into weeks. The orphanage staff stopped calling him for the adoption events. They assumed he had surrendered, that he was simply waiting to fade away. They didn't see the light burning behind his eyelids at 3 light a.m., nor did they notice the way he had started observing the local paramedics whenever they visited the facility for the older boy's injuries. He stopped thinking of his chest as a source of pain and started viewing it as a patient. The patient is struggling, he would think when he felt the familiar, suffocating grip of an episode. The pressure is too high, the oxygen is falling. He would lie flat, practice his breathing, visualize the blood flow, and wait for the rhythm to settle. He was no longer a ward of the state. He was a student. One afternoon, 6 months later, the air in the orphanage was thick with the scent of impending rain. Leo was sitting on the back steps, the medical text spread wide across his knees, when a heavy car door slammed in the driveway. A black sedan sat idling, its engine humming a low, mechanical tune. A woman stepped out, struggling with a heavy briefcase. It was Mrs. Gable. She looked thinner, her face drawn, but she moved with the same entitled haste that had defined her previous visit. She marched toward the front door, oblivious to the boy on the back steps. Leo watched her. He felt a sudden, frantic fluttering in his chest, a visceral reaction to the woman who had labeled him a liability. He closed the book, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked fist. He stood up, his intention simple. He wanted to walk past her. He wanted to look her in the eye and show her that he was not the frail, weeping boy she had discarded. He wanted to be a presence she couldn't ignore. He walked toward the front entrance, his breathing controlled, his pace rhythmic. As he rounded the corner, Mrs. Gable was arguing with Sister Beatrice on the porch steps. She was frantic, her voice high and shrill. I don't care about the policy, sister. I need to see the records. There was a girl here, a foster she. Mrs. Gable stepped backward, her heel catching on the uneven brick of the landing. She stumbled. It happened in slow motion. Her briefcase flew open, scattering papers like falling leaves, and she toppled backward off the stairs, her head hitting the stone driveway with a sickening wet thud. The world went silent. Mrs. Gable lay motionless, a dark stain beginning to spread across the gravel beneath her hair. Sister Beatrice let out a strangled cry. Call an ambulance, someone call. Leo didn't move. He stood on the porch, his eyes locked on the woman's chest. Up, down. The rhythm was irregular, shallow. Trauma to the cranium, to his mind raced, the words from his stolen book flashing behind his eyes. Subdural hematoma, compression of the brainstem. The rhythm is failing, he knew, with a terrifying clarity that transcended his 10 years, that the paramedics were too far away. The orphanage was in a remote corner of the valley. Leo, get back inside! Sister Beatrice screamed, her hands hovering uselessly over the injured woman. Leo ignored her. He stepped down the stairs, his heart kicking against his ribs like a wild animal. He felt the familiar metallic taste of blood in his mouth. The blue was creeping into his fingernails, his lungs crying out for air that wouldn't come. Stay calm, Te, he told himself, his voice internal, cold, and precise. If you collapse, she dies. If you finish this, you win. He knelt beside Mrs. Gable. She was gasping, a labored, fish-out-of-water sound. Airway, Leo whispered, his hands trembling as he reached toward her. I have to clear the airway. He moved with a clinical, surgical grace he had only practiced in his dreams. He tilted her chin, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his own internal monitor screaming for him to stop, his vision blurred at the edges, turning into a vignette of gray and black. Leo, stop! Sister Beatrice lunged for him, but he blocked her with an elbow, his focus absolute. She's dying, Leo gasped, the oxygen in his blood dropping to a critical level. The pressure in her head. He looked at Mrs. Gable's face. For a fleeting second, her eyes fluttered open. She saw him, the boy she had rejected, the boy she had deemed a waste of potential. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition passing through the glaze of shock. You, she breathed, a tiny bubble of blood forming at the corner of her lips. I'm here, Leo said, his voice fading. His heart gave a final erratic lurch. A sharp, searing pain tore through his chest, white-hot and absolute. He felt his knees give out, as he fell forward, collapsing onto the gravel beside her. The last thing he saw was the ambulance lights cresting the hill, a swirling rhythmic blue that pulsed in perfect time with the heart he had spent his whole life trying to master. The world tilted, went black, and then, for the first time, the rhythm stopped. The corridors of St. Jude's orphanage always smelled of floor wax and unfulfilled promises. For 10-year-old Leo, the scent was a reminder of the invisible boundary between those who belonged to the world and those who were merely waiting for it to forget them. He sat in the corner of the library, the only sanctuary that didn't demand he be energetic or charming, for the prospective parents touring the dormitories. His chest felt heavy, a dull rhythmic thrumming that never quite settled into peace. It was the tetralogy of Fallot, a cruel architecture of the heart that dictated how far he could run, how hard he could laugh, and how little he could hope, but in his lap lay Gray's Anatomy, a relic he'd scavenged from the donation bin. Its pages were yellowed, the illustrations of human valves and chambers more beautiful to him than any storybook hero. You're staring at the ventricles again, Leo. Leo didn't jump. He knew the soft, rhythmic click of Nurse Halloway's sensible shoes. She was a woman of 60 with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that saw through the orphanage's bureaucratic indifference. She had been the night shift nurse for years, a ghost in the hallway who usually kept her head down. They look like caverns, Leo whispered, tracing the illustration of the right ventricle with a thin, trembling finger. If I could just understand how the blood is supposed to flow, maybe I could convince mine to follow the map. Nurse Halloway pulled out a chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. She sat down, her gaze lingering on the boy's pale, translucent skin. Your heart doesn't need convincing, Leo. It needs a master. And you are trying to master it with a textbook meant for medical students. I have time, Leo said, his voice quiet but unshakable. I have nothing but time. Halloway reached into her heavy medical bag and produced a small silver stethoscope. She didn't offer a smile, but her expression softened. Close the book. If you want to study the geography of the heart, you don't do it with pictures. You do it with sound. She placed the earpieces in Leo's ears and guided the diaphragm to his chest. Leo gasped. The sound was like a frantic bird trapped in a cage, a chaotic, fluttering rhythm that spoke of struggle. Listen, Halloway commanded softly. That is not a failure. That is a survival mechanism. Your body is working twice as hard as anyone else's in this building. That makes you stronger, not weaker. But strength without discipline is just noise. Over the next few weeks, the library became their classroom. Halloway, once a surgical nurse at the city's premier teaching hospital before a personal tragedy drove her to the anonymity of the orphanage, began to dismantle the myths Leo held about his own body. She taught him the language of the pulse, the clinical reality of cyanosis, and the precise, cold beauty of surgical intervention. You are reading, but you aren't learning the why, she said one evening, pointing to a diagram of a pulmonary valve. Surgery isn't just about cutting, it's about restoring balance. If you want to be a surgeon, you have to be the calmest person in the room. When you get emotional, your heart rate spikes. When your heart rate spikes, your oxygen levels drop. Do you see the trap? Leo nodded, his breath hitching. I have to be cold. You have to be objective, she corrected, tapping his temple. You have to love the medicine more than you fear the patient's or your own inevitable end. He spent his days in the classroom, acting the part of the frail child, but his nights were spent in the clinic of Leo, as he had dubbed the small, hidden alcove behind the boiler room. There he practiced sutures on scraps of discarded fabric and studied the mechanics of blood pressure with a discarded cuff Halloway had gifted him. The change in him was tectonic. He stopped looking at the prospective parents with longing. He looked at them with a diagnostic gaze. He assessed their gait, their labored breathing, the color of their nail beds. He wasn't a child waiting for a family anymore. He was a scientist observing a flawed species. One rainy Tuesday, the atmosphere at St. Jude's shifted. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, cutting through the mud like a predatory shark. From the window, Leo watched as Mrs. Gable emerged. The woman looked different, older, her face etched with the sharp lines of a life that hadn't been as kind as her wealth suggested. She walked with a cane, her movements stiff. She was back, likely looking for a project to satisfy a sense of performative charity. Stay here, Halloway warned, sensing the tension in Leo's frame. Her arrival doesn't change your trajectory. She's the one who said I was too much of an investment, Leo muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped his stethoscope. She was a woman who didn't understand the value of what she was looking at, Halloway said. Don't prove her right by losing your focus. But the universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. As Mrs. Gable navigated the slippery stone steps of the orphanage entrance, the heel of her shoe caught on a slick patch of moss. It happened in slow motion. Her body twisted, her cane skittered away, and she tumbled backward, hitting her head against the stone base of the fountain with a sickening wet thud. The scream that tore through the courtyard came from the receptionist, but the silence that followed was Leo's. He stood by the library window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate drum. He could see Mrs. Gable lying still, a dark crimson stain beginning to bloom against the gray stone. Leo, sit down! Halloway commanded, her voice sharp. He didn't listen. He felt a sudden, icy clarity, a detachment that he had practiced for months. He pushed past the nurse, his legs moving with a strange and unnatural efficiency. He reached the heavy oak doors and swung them open, stepping out into the freezing rain. The air hit his lungs like shards of glass. His vision blurred, the world tilting at the edges, but he focused on the target. The woman who had once decided he was not worth the cost of a life. He knelt beside her, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He didn't care about the rain or the terrified whispers of the other children gathering in the doorway. He reached out, pressing 2 fingers to her carotid artery. Thump, thump. Silence. Her pulse was erratic, fading. She's in shock, Leo whispered, his voice clinical, detached, entirely his own. He looked at the trauma to her head, a jagged laceration. He needed pressure. He needed a clear airway. Leo, get back. Sister Beatrice, the head of the orphanage, was running toward them, her habit flapping in the wind. You'll kill yourself, boy. Look at your face. Leo ignored her. He saw the world in shades of red and blue, the biology of a dying machine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the clean folded handkerchief Halloway had given him for his own nosebleeds. He pressed it firmly against the wound, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from the massive, agonizing strain on his own heart. Internal hemorrhage, Leo said, his voice sounding like it was coming from miles away. Elevate her legs. I need a blanket now. His command was so jarring, so adult, that even the panicked Sister Beatrice obeyed. She grabbed a wool blanket from the mud and covered Mrs. Gable. Leo leaned over the woman. He could see the recognition in her eyes as they fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She looked at the boy she had rejected, and for a second the confusion in her eyes gave way to a dawning, horrific understanding. Leo? She wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth. Don't speak, Leo said, his own vision darkening. The edges of the world were closing in, the sound of the rain turning into a rhythmic, deafening roar, his own heart failing to keep pace with the urgency of the moment. You have a subdural hematoma, you need a trauma center, you need a neurosurgeon. Why? She coughed, her hand twitching toward him. Why help me? Leo looked at her, his lips blue, his skin the color of ash. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with blood flow and everything to do with agency. He had decided, for the first time in his life, that he was not a liability, he was a guardian. Because, Leo gasped, his chest tightening to the point of agony, I am the only one here who knows exactly what it feels like to be broken, and I won't let you be discarded. He leaned in to stabilize her head, his hands steady despite the tremor in his legs. He was the anchor. He was the surgeon. Suddenly, the wail of a siren pierced the air, growing louder, closer. Leo felt a sharp electric pain fire through his chest, a snap like a wire breaking inside his ribs. The world tilted violently. He tried to maintain his grip on Mrs. Gable, but his fingers slipped. He collapsed against the wet stone of the fountain, his lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come. As the paramedics swarmed around them, shouting orders and moving with practiced speed, Leo watched from the ground. He saw them lift Mrs. Gable onto a stretcher, saw them rush to save her. He saw his own hand, limp and pale, resting in the mud. He tried to call out to the lead paramedic to tell them what he had observed, to give them the diagnosis, but his voice was gone. The darkness was creeping in, heavy and absolute. The last thing he felt was the wet, cold earth against his cheek, and the distant, muffled sound of someone shouting his name. Not the name of a liability, but the name of a hero. The ambulance door slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and as the vehicle began to pull away, Leo's world flickered once, twice, and then nothing. The scent of antiseptic was the only perfume Leo had ever truly known. It clung to the corridors of the city hospital like a ghost, a reminder of the place where he had spent more hours than any child should. At 22, Leo was a collection of sharp angles and frantic ambition. He looked like a man sketched in charcoal, all jagged edges and dark, hollowed-out eyes. He worked the night shift as a janitor in the surgical wing, mopping floors and scrubbing tiles. Not because he had an affinity for bleach, but because it allowed him to hover near the swinging doors of the operating theaters. When the surgeons left, exhausted and smelling of ionized air, Leo would steal into the observation gallery, his heart rhythm stuttering like a dying engine in his chest. His heart was a traitor. Every beat was a labored, metallic thud hiss, a reminder of the tetralogy of Fallot that had tethered his life to the shadow of death. But while his heart failed him, his mind was a weapon. He had taught himself anatomy with the feverish obsession of a man trying to dismantle a bomb he was strapped to. You're staring again, Leo. A voice echoed through the sterile silence of the prep room. Leo didn't jump. He kept his eyes on the suture kit left on the tray. It was Dr. Eris, a veteran cardiothoracic surgeon whose hands were as steady as a surgeon's steel, but whose eyes were often heavy with the weight of the patients he couldn't pull back from the ledge. I'm learning, doctor, Leo said, his voice raspy, the result of a persistent low-grade exhaustion. You're mopping, Leo, Eris corrected, though there was no malice in his tone. That's what the contract says. $3 an hour to keep the floor spotless, not to memorize the technique for a mitral valve repair. Leo finally looked up. He gripped the handle of his mop until his knuckles turned ivory. If I knew how to do it, I wouldn't need to watch. If I could perform the repair myself, I wouldn't be standing here waiting for the world to decide if I'm worth saving. Eris paused, the light from the overhead lamps casting long, dramatic shadows across his face. He looked at the boy who had been tossed aside by families and social services alike, the boy who now, through sheer force of will, was paying his own way through medical school one shift at a time. You talk as if medicine is a battle, Leo. It's a craft. You need a calm heart to master it. If only I had one, Leo thought, but he stayed silent. His chest felt tight, the pressure behind his sternum growing. He ignored the warning signs, the way the room seemed to tilt whenever he exerted himself too much. He had a shift to finish, and an anatomy lecture at 6 in the morning. The university was a monolith of cold stone and unyielding expectations. Leo moved through the halls like a specter. He was the kid who wore the same 2 shirts, the kid who smelled faintly of hospital floor cleaner, the kid who collapsed in the library once but had been back at his desk an hour later. He was currently failing his social life, but winning the war against his textbooks. Leo, you look like you're about to shatter, Sarah, a fellow student, whispered during their histology lab. She reached out to touch his arm, but Leo recoiled, a defensive reflex born of years of being handled like damaged goods. I'm fine, he snapped, then softened his tone. I'm sorry, I need to understand this. If I don't understand the mechanism of the heart, who will? You aren't the only one who needs to pass this, Leo. You're the only one trying to memorize the entire library before the midterm. He didn't explain that for him. The textbook wasn't just data, it was his survival manual. He spent his nights in a cramped apartment that cost more than he earned, studying until his vision blurred into black spots. His diet was coffee and stolen sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria. The physical toll was mounting. He found himself winded after climbing a single flight of stairs, his skin turning a waxy, translucent gray. He spent his money on tuition and expensive medical journals, leaving nothing for the medication he desperately needed to stabilize his arrhythmias. He was gambling with his life, placing his bets on his own intelligence, hoping he could reach the residency stage before his heart finally decided it had had enough. 6 months later. The hospital was a chaotic symphony of alarms and rushing gurneys. It was a stormy Tuesday night, the kind of weather that brought the worst of the city's tragedies through the trauma bay doors. Leo was scrubbing the floor in the main lobby when the sirens began to wail. Not the steady rhythm of a routine transport, but the frantic, sustained shriek of an ambulance arriving with a code red. "Make way," a paramedic shouted, pushing through the doors. Leo straightened up, his back aching, a dull, thumping pain radiating from his chest. He watched as the team maneuvered a gurney toward the trauma bay. A woman lay on the bed, her face obscured by an oxygen mask, her hair matted with blood. He didn't mean to follow. He told himself he was going to empty the trash bin in the hallway. But as he passed the trauma bay window, he glanced in. His stomach dropped into his shoes. The woman's features, though bruised and distorted by the trauma, were unmistakable. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who 14 years ago had looked at a 10-year-old Leo in the orphanage and whispered to the social worker, "He's a ticking time bomb. I'm looking for a son, not a funeral arrangement." She was 40 years older, dressed in silk that was now shredded and soaked in crimson, but the eyes, the cold, dismissive eyes, were the same, even now, fixed in a glassy, unconscious stare. "BP is crashing. She's hemorrhaging internally." Dr. Eris's voice cut through the air. "Get the ore ready. Now." Leo pressed his hands against the glass. The heat in his chest spiked, a sharp stabbing agony that stole his breath. He saw the monitor. Her heart rate was erratic, struggling to maintain a rhythm. It was the same rhythm he felt in his own chest, every single day. She's going to die he thought. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. The woman who had rejected him for being broken was now the one who was truly broken. And he was the only one standing there with the knowledge to potentially understand the complexity of the damage. He watched the team struggle. They were talented, but they were missing the nuances of her specific injury. A trauma that required a delicate, unorthodox approach he had read about in a rare case study just 3 nights ago. "She's slipping," Eris shouted. "Come on, stay with us." Leo's head began to spin. The lights in the corridor seemed to dim and brighten in a violent strobe effect. "I have to help T," he thought. "I have to show her. I have to show them all." He pushed through the double doors. "Leo, get out," a nurse yelled, not looking up from her task. "She has an arterial tear behind the thoracic cavity," Leo said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the fire in his lungs. "If you clamp the aorta there, you're just forcing the pressure into the cerebral arteries. You need to bypass the shunt, not block it." Eris looked up, his mask slipping slightly. "What did you say, the shunt?" Leo breathed, stumbling forward. The pain in his chest was a blinding white light now. He grabbed the side of the table to steady himself, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of the surgical tray. "Use the secondary approach. The trauma is localized, but the pressure is the killer." "He's right," a resident murmured, looking at the scan. "Dr. Eris." "He's right." Eris didn't hesitate. He pivoted, his hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman, following the logic Leo had laid out. The monitors began to stabilize. The jagged, dying lines on the screen smoothed into a steady, rhythmic pulse. Leo watched, a strange, transcendent peace washing over him. He had done it. He had saved the person who had once deemed him a liability. He had proven that his life, his intellect, his struggle, all had value. But as the room slowed down, as the life-saving procedure took hold, the world began to tilt violently to the left. "Leo?" Eris shouted, turning back to the janitor. Leo tried to take a step, but his legs didn't belong to him anymore. They were blocks of lead, sinking into the polished linoleum. He felt his own heart, that defiant, treacherous organ, give one final, heavy lurch. It was as if a heavy curtain were being drawn over his eyes, stage left to stage right. "I am a surgeon," he thought, the words echoing in the silence of his collapsing mind. "I am more than a broken heart." He slumped against the ore table. The last thing he saw was the look of shock on Eris's face, and the steady, beautiful green glow of the monitor, heartbeat after heartbeat, perfectly synchronized. Then the darkness arrived, not with fear, but with the clinical silence of a finished operation. "Code blue," someone screamed. "We've got a code blue in the ore!" Leo didn't hear the rest. He was already somewhere else, drifting through the anatomy of his own existence, finally, mercifully, at rest. Or so he thought, until a sharp, searing pain erupted in his chest, a sudden electric shock that jolted him, pulling him back toward the surface of a world he wasn't quite ready to leave. His eyes snapped open, but the ceiling was spinning, and the monitors were screaming a song he didn't recognize. "He's crashing! Charge the paddles!" The voice belonged to Eris, and then everything went silent again. The fluorescent lights of the surgical ward hummed with the sound Leo had come to identify as the heartbeat of the building. It was a sterile, mechanical vibration that resonated deep within his own chest, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the ticking time bomb he carried behind his ribs. At 24, Leo was no longer the frail boy who had scrubbed floors in the dead of night, clutching stolen medical journals like holy scripture. He was a man of medicine, a final-year student whose hands, though occasionally prone to a tremor, were guided by a surgeon's iron-willed discipline. But today, the hum felt different. Today the hum was for him. "You're staring, Leo." Leo blinked, pulling his gaze away from the glass viewing gallery of the operating theater. Dr. Eris, the man who had overseen Leo's transformation from an invisible janitor to a promising protege, stood beside him. Eris looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deep by decades of making life-or-death calls. "It's not every day a resident gets to be the patient of the chief of cardio," Leo replied, his voice raspy but steady. "It's a bold procedure," Eris said, his tone dropping into a professional register that lacked its usual warmth. "Experimental. Risky. Your tetralogy of Fallow has progressed, Leo. The pulmonary stenosis is tightening its grip. If we don't repair the valve and correct the bypass pathways now, We won't be talking about a career in surgery. We'll be talking about a funeral. Leo nodded. He had known this moment was coming since he had first opened Gray's Anatomy at the age of 10. He had studied his own pathology with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. He knew exactly what the scalpel would do to him, and he knew exactly what the failure rate was. I'm ready, Leo said. Are you? Eris looked at him, searching his face for the fear he expected to find there. You've spent your life being defined by what you couldn't do. You were the bad investment, the orphan with the broken heart. You realize that after this there is no hiding. You'll be in the spotlight. You'll be a surgeon. I was a surgeon the moment I decided my life had value, Leo whispered, looking back through the glass. Everything since then has just been training. The prep room was cold. The air tasted of ozone and antiseptic, a sharp, biting scent that always made Leo's senses sharpen. As he lay on the table, the familiar weight of the anesthesia mask hovered over him, a dark shroud promising either oblivion or a second chance. He thought of the orphanage, of the mud on his knees when he tried to help Mrs. Gable, of the way the air had felt thin and jagged in his lungs back then. He had spent his life trying to prove he wasn't a liability. He had lived as if he were already a ghost, haunting the hallways of hospitals, waiting for the day he could step out of the shadows. Inducing now, Leo, the anesthesiologist said softly. Count backward from 10. 10, he thought of the textbook. 9, he thought of the anatomy diagrams he'd drawn in the margins of his school books. 8, he thought of the look on Dr. Eris's face when he'd saved Mrs. Gable in that chaotic OR intervention. That moment of recognition that he was more than a janitor. 7, he felt the rhythm of his heart, fluttering like a trapped bird. 6, he felt the cold creep up his limbs. 5, he realized for the first time he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of never having lived. For the darkness didn't come as a void, it came as a rush of memories. He was back in the OR, but he was holding the scalpel this time. He was standing over a patient, and for once, he wasn't the boy who needed to be fixed. He was the one fixing. Blood pressure is bottoming out. The voice drifted to him from a great distance. It was panicked, high-pitched, the antithesis of the calm, controlled environment of a professional surgery. He's not responding to the pressors. The valve isn't seating. Leo felt himself floating in a space between consciousness and the deep, heavy anchor of the anesthesia. He wasn't in his body, he was above it. He could see the theater clearly. The bright, piercing LED lights, the flurry of movement, the masks of the surgical team. Dr. Eris was there, his brow furrowed, his hands working with a speed that bordered on desperation. The monitor was screaming, a high-pitched, jagged tone that signaled the end of a rhythm. Charge to 200. Thump. Leo's body jumped against the restraints. The monitors flickered, then flatlined into a long, continuous drone. Come on, Leo, Eris muttered, his voice cracking. You fought the world to get here. You don't get to quit now. Leo watched with a strange, detached curiosity. He saw the trauma that had defined his existence, the physical architecture of his heart that had been failing him since birth. It was a machine that had been improperly built, and for 24 years it had been held together by nothing more than pure, unadulterated willpower. If I go back, Leo thought, looking at the stillness of his own chest. If I go back, I have to be the surgeon, not the boy, not the orphan. The surgeon the team continued to work, a flurry of activity focused on the boy who nobody wanted. They were doing it for him, not because he was a patient, but because they had seen the fire in him. Eris leaned over, his voice urgent and raw. If you can hear me, Leo, there's a world out there that needs you. We don't need more doctors who just memorize anatomy. We need doctors who know what it's like to be broken. Stay with us. Leo felt the pull. It was like an undertow dragging him away from the warmth of the light and back into the cage of his own ribs. The pain began to register first, a dull, throbbing ache that bloomed into a searing, white-hot fire as his heart felt the electric shock of the paddles. He gasped, a sound he couldn't hear but felt vibrate through his soul. The monitors beeped once, a slow, hesitant rhythm. Then again. The surgeons froze, their eyes locked on the screen. Wait, one of them whispered. The rhythm stabilized. It was weak, irregular, and fragile, but it was there. Leo felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of his own flesh reasserting itself. He was back in the cage, he was back in the pain. But he was alive. Hours later, the recovery room was silent, save for the steady, rhythmic, whoosh click of the ventilator. Leo lay perfectly still, his eyes closed. His body felt as if it had been put through a meat grinder. His chest was heavy, bandaged, and aching with a deep systemic trauma. But the heart beneath the dressings, the heart that had defied every statistic, every prediction, every rejection, was beating on its own. He drifted in and out of a medicated haze. In his dreams, he was walking through the halls of the hospital, but he wasn't wearing a janitor's gray uniform. He was wearing the white coat. The coat felt heavy, like armor. He heard the door creak open. He didn't have the strength to open his eyes, but he felt a presence standing by his bed. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? It was a woman's voice, older, trembling with a fragile sort of grace. Leo's eyelids fluttered. Through the haze he saw her, Mrs. Gable. She looked tired, her arm in a sling, her face marked by the scars of the accident he had helped save her from. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name, a mix of disbelief, shame, and something bordering on awe. I heard, she whispered, leaning closer. Her eyes were wet. They told me you were the one. You saved me. And then you almost died doing it. Leo tried to speak, but his throat was raw from the tube. He could only manage a slow, labored breath. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. I turned you away. I looked at you and saw nothing worth saving. Why would you sacrifice everything for me? Leo forced his eyes open. He looked at her, seeing not the woman who had rejected him, but the human being who had suffered. He had moved past the bitterness. He had moved past the liability. He was a surgeon now. And surgeons didn't judge their patients, they healed them. He managed a weak, fleeting smile. His hand, heavy and bruised, moved across the bedsheet toward hers. I was never a liability, he rasped, the words barely audible in the quiet room. I was just a case study. Mrs. Gable squeezed his hand, her tears falling onto the sterile white linen. You're going to be a great surgeon, Leo. I am a surgeon, he corrected, his voice a whisper. Suddenly the monitor beside him, which had been tracking a steady rhythm, began to stutter. The steady beep, beep, beep turned into a rapid, erratic staccato. Leo's breath hitched. A sharp, stinging pain erupted in his chest, a sensation of tearing, of something giving way that wasn't supposed to. Mrs. Gable jumped back, her face turning pale. Nurse! Nurse, get in here! The door flew open. Dr. Aris rushed in, his face hardening as he looked at the monitors. Leo? Leo, look at me. Leo couldn't look at him. The world was spinning. The room was tilting, the light from the overhead lamps blurring into streaks of white. He felt a coldness wash over him, starting at his toes and rushing toward his heart. He felt the surgical team piling into the room, their voices overlapping in a frantic blur. He felt the cold touch of an IV line being pushed. But beneath it all, he felt the rhythm of his heart failing again. Not because of the surgery, but because of something else. Something deep within the tissue that even the surgeons hadn't seen. As the chaos swirled around him, as the alarms shrieked and the team scrambled to stabilize a life that seemed determined to slip away, Leo's eyes drifted to the small window in the door. He saw his own reflection in the glass. He looked like a surgeon. And then everything went black. The heart monitor, once again, began its long, descending, singular note, a sound that echoed through the room, through his mind, and into the terrifying silence that followed. The fluorescent lights of the operating room were the only stars Leo ever cared to navigate by. To the rest of the world, Dr. Leo Vance was a miracle worker, a man whose hands possessed an almost supernatural, steadying grace. To Leo, those hands were merely tools calibrated by years of obsession, pain, and the cold, clinical reality of his own internal rhythm. He stood by the scrub sink, the water rushing over his forearms, cool and purifying. It was a ritual. He closed his eyes, hearing the steady thump-thump of his own heart, a rhythmic cadence that he had spent his entire life trying to negotiate with. It was an erratic, patched-together beat, a repaired engine that demanded constant respect. The patient is ready, Dr. Vance, the scrub nurse, Sarah, said softly. She had been with him through 300 procedures. She knew the way he tilted his head when he was listening to a rhythm that only he could hear. 12-year-old boy. Transposition of the great arteries. The regional hospital called it a death sentence. Leo nodded, snapping his gloves into place. A death sentence is just a medical opinion, Sarah. Let's go change it. As he entered OR4, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of the ventilators, the scent of antiseptic, the sterile glow. It was his cathedral. He approached the table. The boy looked small, fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in a storm. Leo felt that familiar sharp ache in his own chest, a ghost of the boy he had been, the boy nobody wanted, the boy who had spent nights in the orphanage library reading about valves and ventricles, mapping out the architecture of his own survival. Anesthesia is induced, the anesthesiologist announced. Leo stepped up to the table. His movements precise and economical. Scalpel. He made the incision. The world narrowed down to the crimson landscape beneath his blade. He worked with a singular, terrifying focus. For the next 5 hours, there was no past, no Mrs. Gable, no memory of being a liability. There was only the anatomy, the plumbing of the human heart, and the desperate, beautiful struggle to keep the spark alive. When he finally sutured the last layer of tissue, he let out a long, shuddering breath. The monitor chirped a steady, rhythmic, healthy song. Beautiful work, doctor, Sarah whispered. Leo stepped back, his legs momentarily weak. He leaned against the instrument tray. Close him up. I'll be in my office. He walked through the sliding doors, pulling his mask down. He felt the familiar pull of exhaustion, a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders. He reached his office, a cramped room filled with textbooks and medical journals, and collapsed into his leather chair. He stared at the plaque on his desk. Dr. Leo Vance, Chief of Pediatric Cardiovascular Surgery. It felt like a dream. He had survived the rejection, the orphanage, the fear, the surgeries. He had built an empire out of his own broken pieces. His pager buzzed, a sharp, jarring intrusion. He glanced at it. Stat. Trauma room 2. Emergency incoming. Leo didn't hesitate. He was already moving. He reached the ICU doors just as a team of paramedics burst through the entrance. They were covered in grease, shouting orders, their voices a cacophony of urgency. 60-year-old female, MVA, high-speed impact. Crushed chest, pericardial tamponade, losing blood pressure fast. Leo pushed through the double doors, his eyes scanning the gurney. The woman was unconscious, her face bruised and pale, a mask of oxygen over her mouth. She was draped in a neck brace, her chest heaving with shallow, agonizing breaths. Leo froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He knew that face. Even through the trauma, the swelling and the blood, he knew the sharp line of the jaw, the specific way her hair had grayed at the temples. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who had looked at a 10-year-old Leo, a boy with blue-tinged lips and terrified eyes, and sighed with a chilling, hollow indifference. He's sick, sister. I wanted a child, not a medical project. I'm sorry, but this is a bad investment. The memories flooded back, sharp as needles. The orphanage, the silence in the hallway, the feeling of being discarded like a piece of faulty machinery. Doctor, we need to act, the resident shouted, snapping Leo out of his paralysis. Her vitals are bottoming out. We need an emergency thoracotomy. Leo felt his own heart, that scarred, heroic, struggling organ, skip a beat. A dangerous, jagged rhythm fluttered in his chest. He took a breath, forcing his surgeon's calm over the rising tide of his history. Move, Leo commanded. his voice cold and steady. He moved to the bedside. He saw the trauma, the sheer mechanical violence done to her body. His hands didn't tremble. They were the hands of a professional, the hands of a man who had saved hundreds of children, the hands that now held the life of the person who had once decided he wasn't worth saving. She's in shock, Leo said, his eyes locked on the monitor. Prep for a sternotomy. We're going in. As the team scrambled, Leo stood over her. She was a ghost of his past, lying under the harsh hospital lights, completely at the mercy of the man she had once walked away from. Doctor, do you know her? The nurse asked, noticing his stillness. Leo didn't look up. He picked up the scalpel, the steel cool and familiar in his grip. I know exactly who she is. He plunged the blade into her chest. The procedure was brutal. Time became a blur of suction, red, and the mechanical metallic sound of the rib spreader. Mrs. Gable's heart was failing, a massive contusion, a tear in the myocardium. It was the kind of wound that would break even the best surgeons. She's fibrillating, someone screamed. Charging to 200, clear. Her body bucked. The monitor remained flat. Again, Leo barked clear, nothing. Leo watched the monitor. He saw the flat line, the same line he had looked at during his own nightmares, the same line that had marked his life of struggle. He looked down at her, at the woman who had defined his childhood as one of limitations. He reached into the chest cavity, his gloved hands touching the muscle. He felt the coldness of death setting in. She's gone, doctor, the resident said, his voice dropping. It's been over 10 minutes. We have to call it. No, Leo whispered. The word wasn't an instruction. It was a prayer. Dr. Vance, we have to respect the protocol. The resident urged. Leo didn't listen. He began to compress the heart directly, his fingers applying pressure, forcing the rhythm, forcing life back into the tissue. He was pouring his own energy into her, ignoring the protest in his own chest, the sharp, stinging pain radiating from his ribs, the way his vision began to blur at the edges. Doctor, you're pale, the nurse noted, her voice trembling. Dr. Vance, please, step back. I am the surgeon, Leo hissed through gritted teeth, and I don't give up on patients. He felt a massive surge of pain, a lightning bolt of agony that tore through his chest. It felt like his own heart was trying to claw its way out of his rib cage. He stumbled, his hands slipping against the wet, visceral landscape of the open chest. Leo, the room began to spin. The monitors, the lights, the faces of his colleagues. They all dissolved into a swirling vortex of white noise. He felt his knees give way. As he fell, his hand gripped the edge of the operating table, his fingers digging into the metal, his heart finally reaching the breaking point of its endurance. Just before his world went entirely black, he saw the monitor jump. A single jagged pulse, a heartbeat. Mrs. Gable was alive. But as the heart monitor began to beep a steady, triumphant rhythm for the woman on the table, Leo Vance collapsed onto the linoleum floor. His own monitor, the one connected to his own, failing, glorious heart, began to emit a long, mournful, unbroken tone. The fluorescent lights of the St. Jude's emergency department hummed with a frequency that Dr. Leo Vance usually found rhythmic. A comforting, steady drone that matched the heartbeat he monitored on the screens surrounding him. Tonight, however, the frequency felt jagged. It grated against the base of his skull, a warning hum he had learned to interpret over the last 2 decades as a surgeon. Dr. Vance, we've got an incoming, code red aortic dissection. 72-year-old female. Unstable blood pressure, tearing chest pain radiating to the back. Leo stood at the nursing station, his charts abandoned. He didn't need to look at the name on the tablet to know that the heavy doors of the ambulance bay were about to swing open. He felt the cold iron of his own heart condition, that familiar, tightening ache, flare in his chest, not from pain, but from a strange premonitory dread. He followed the nurses to the trauma bay. The paramedics rushed in, a whirlwind of adrenaline and wet pavement scent. They slammed the gurney into place, and there she was, even through the silvering of hair and the map of wrinkles that age had etched onto her face. The recognition was instantaneous. Her eyes were closed, pinched shut in agony, but the slope of her nose, the specific, sharp set of her jaw, it was Mrs. Gable. 20 years ago, she had stood in the drafty hallway of St. Jude's orphanage, holding a clipboard like a shield. She had looked at 10-year-old Leo, looked at his medical file, and looked at the nurse, saying, "He's a liability, dear. A bad investment. I'm looking for a son, not a charity project." Leo had spent half his life trying to prove that his existence wasn't a transaction, and now, the woman who had put a price tag on his soul was bleeding out on his table. "BP is crashing, 80/40, the lead resident, Dr. Aris, shouted, his voice cracking with the intensity of the situation. "She's tamponating. We need to move. Start the rapid infusion," Leo said, his voice eerily calm, cutting through the chaos. He stepped to the side of the table, his movements precise, almost mechanical. He looked down at her. Mrs. Gable let out a ragged, whistling breath, her fingers clawing at the restraints. She was flickering between consciousness and the void. She didn't recognize him. Not yet. To her, he was just a surgeon, a man in a mask and sterile blue drapes. "Dr. Vance." Eris leaned in, eyes wide. "The dissection is extensive. We're losing her. If we don't get her to the OR for an emergent repair, she won't last another 10 minutes. "I know," Leo said. He looked at the monitor. Her heart rate was erratic, a fluttering, dying bird. His own chest throbbed in sympathetic rhythm. Every beat she missed felt like a ghost of his own childhood, an echo of the nights he had spent in the orphanage, listening to his own heart struggle to push blood through a failing valve. "Get her to OR3. Now," Leo commanded. The operating room was a cold white cathedral. The scent of betadine and antiseptic hung heavy in the air. As the team prepped, Leo stood at the scrub sink, watching the water run over his hands. His heart, his own damaged, surgically repaired heart, was beating too fast. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to summon the detached, clinical persona he had cultivated to survive his career. He walked into the OR. Mrs. Gable was intubated now, her chest wide open, the sternum spread with mechanical, terrifying force. The team worked with the frantic speed of people trying to catch a falling star. "Clamp," Leo said. As he worked, the memories didn't stay buried. He remembered the smell of the orphanage's linoleum. He remembered the feeling of being 5 pounds underweight and feeling like a burden to the very walls he lived within. He remembered the day she left, the sound of her heels clicking away on the pavement, leaving him behind in the gray afternoon. He was the one who had survived. She was the one dying. "She's fibrillating," the anesthesiologist announced, panic rising in his voice. "Leo, she's losing rhythm. Internal pads," Leo said, his voice devoid of tremor. He took the paddles, his hands steady as stone. He placed them against the exposed, pale muscle of her heart. Charge, clear, the jolt didn't work. Again, nothing. Leo leaned over the table. He looked at her face, the face that had discarded him. For a moment, the medical theater fell away, and he was back in that orphanage office, the rejection stinging like a slap. He could let her go. He could declare the time of death and walk out, and no one would blame him. It was a massive dissection. Mortality rates were abysmal. It was the correct medical outcome. But then he looked at her heart. It was a biological machine, a pump that was refusing to function. And he, more than anyone else in the world, understood the tyranny of a failing heart. "I am not going to let you die," he whispered. He stepped back, his own vision swimming. The pressure in his chest was becoming a crushing weight, as if his heart were trying to beat its way out of his ribcage to join hers in the fight. "Give me the scalpel and the graft," he growled. He moved with a speed that defied the laws of fatigue. He bypassed the traditional protocols, using a technique he had spent years perfecting in the dead of night at the hospital, long after his shifts ended. He was stitching, suturing, and navigating the anatomy of a woman who had taught him that life was a zero-sum game. "BP is rising," Eris said, breathless. She's holding. "Leo, you're doing it." The surgery was a miracle of precision. But as Leo tied the final knot, the world around him began to tilt. The bright surgical lights began to pulse, dimming and brightening in a way that had nothing to do with the electrical grid. The room felt suddenly, impossibly hot. "Dr. Vance?" Eris asked, noticing Leo's hand trembling as he reached for the needle driver. "Are you all right?" I'm fine," Leo said, but the words felt like they were coming from underwater. He looked down at the table. Mrs. Gable's heart was beating. It was a strong, steady rhythm. The pink hue was returning to her tissues. He had saved her. He had taken the liability and turned it into a success. But his own heart was screaming. The rhythm that had carried him through 20 years of struggle was failing. He had pushed it too hard. The stress of the OR, the weight of the past, the physical toll of his own congenital defect reacting to the adrenaline. He felt a sharp, icy spike go through his chest. It felt like a knife being driven between his ribs. "Vance!" The sound of his name was a distant roar. Leo stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the instrument tray. A cascade of metal clattered to the floor, a deafening metallic crash that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "Leo," he reached out, trying to grab the edge of the operating table to steady himself, but his fingers were numb. They didn't feel like his own. He slumped. He didn't fall all the way, not at first. He slid down the side of the table, his lab coat dragging through the blood on the floor. "He's in arrest! Get the cart!" someone screamed. The ore exploded into motion. People were shouting, monitors were shrieking, and the world was narrowing down to a single, pinpoint dot of darkness at the center of his vision. Leo lay on the cold, sterile floor. Above him, he could see the team hovering, doctors he had trained, residents he had mentored. They were leaning over him, their faces masks of terror. He looked toward the table one last time. Mrs. Gable was still alive. Her chest rose and fell, shallowly, but rhythmically. He had saved her. He had proven them all wrong. He wasn't a liability. He wasn't a mistake. He was the man who had fixed what was broken. The darkness rushed in, swallowing the light, swallowing the sound of the alarms, swallowing the cold. He felt a sudden strange peace, the weight of his heart finally lifting. Floating away into the dark. "Code Blue!" Eris was shouting, his hands pressing down on Leo's chest, the rhythm of his CPR a desperate, frantic sound. Leo closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was the flat, unwavering tone of a monitor somewhere in the distance, a sound he had heard 1,000 times but never quite like this. He wasn't sure if it was hers or if it was his. The sterile, recirculated air of the surgical wing always tasted of antiseptic and cold steel. For Dr. Leo Vance, it was the only air he had ever truly felt comfortable breathing. His movements were a study in economy, the flick of a wrist to secure his mask, the synchronized ritual of a surgical scrub, the steady, rhythmic cadence of his breathing. But tonight, the rhythm was off. The monitor in the holding bay hummed with a frequency that seemed to vibrate directly against his sternum, a subtle, rhythmic thud that reminded him, always, of the tetralogy of fallow that had tethered his life to these halls since birth. "Dr. Vance, everything all right?" Leo blinked, pulling himself back from the precipice of his own physiology. Dr. Eris, his senior resident, was hovering by the automated chart kiosk. "Just a long shift, Eris. What do we have?" Leo's voice was calm, a sharp instrument honed by years of practice. "Trauma, mid-50s, female. Multi-system injuries from a high-velocity collision. Internal hemorrhaging, probable cardiac tamponade, and she's trending toward instability. Her name is Evelyn Gable." The name hit Leo like a physical blow to the solar plexus. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, the world tilted. He saw the faded linoleum floors of the St. Jude's orphanage. He felt the phantom chill of a drafty hallway where a woman in a fur-collared coat had looked down at a 10-year-old boy, her eyes devoid of warmth, her lips curling into a sneer of dismissal. "He's a bad investment," she had said to the sister superior, her voice crisp as autumn leaves. "I wanted a boy who could play ball, not one who turns blue if he runs to the mailbox. This heart of his, It's a liability. He remembered the way she hadn't even looked back when she walked out the door. She hadn't seen a child. She had seen a broken machine with a warranty she didn't want to honor. Dr. Vance? Eris asked, frowning. You know her? Leo forced a mask of indifference onto his face, locking the memory in a dark, airtight drawer. I know the name, he said, his tone clinical. Let's go. The operating room was a theater of controlled chaos. The patient lay shrouded in blue drapes, her chest cavity already opened by the trauma team, revealing the wet, rhythmic machinery of a life. As Leo stepped toward the table, the familiar scent of iron and blood filled his senses. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the heart. It was a failing organ, battered by the force of the steering wheel, struggling to maintain a beat against the pressure of the fluid surrounding it. He reached for the scalpel, his fingers steady, even as the tachycardia in his own chest flared, a sympathetic response to the sight of her trauma. Clamp, Leo commanded. She's crashing, Dr. Vance, the anesthesiologist signaled. BP is bottoming out. We're losing her. Leo ignored the alarms. They were just noise, background static. He focused on the tissue, the delicate architecture of the pericardium. He saw the tear in the wall of the right ventricle, a jagged rip that was leaking life into the chest cavity. It was a complex repair, one that required absolute stillness and a surgeon whose hands were extensions of his own will. Suction, he said, his voice dropping an octave. He worked with a ferocity that bordered on the transcendent. Every stitch was a rebuttal to the woman on the table. You called me a liability, T, he thought, his movements blurring as he tied a suture with impossible precision. You said I was worth nothing. As he worked, his own vision began to swim. The lights of the R, usually so crisp, flared into blinding halos. A sharp, stinging pain radiated from behind his ribs, a reminder that his own heart, that broken thing she had mocked, was struggling to keep pace with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Dr. Vance, you're sweating, Eris noted, his voice tight. Do you need a moment? I don't need a moment, Leo snapped, his focus narrowing until all that existed was the beating muscle beneath his fingertips. I need you to keep that heart-lung machine running. She is not dying on my table. He felt a deep, primal satisfaction in the act. He was the master of her existence now. He was the arbiter of the very thing she had deemed useless. He watched as he successfully reconnected the vessels, his fingers moving with a grace that mocked the frailty of his own body. Cardiac activity is picking up, the anesthesiologist called out. Sinus rhythm is returning. Leo stepped back, his chest heaving. The room began to tilt. The floor seemed to lose its solidity, undulating like the deck of a ship in a storm. He felt a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. Dr. Vance, you're pale, Eris said, dropping the retraction tool and moving toward him. Leo shook his head, reaching out to steady himself against the surgical trolley, but his hand missed. His fingers brushed against the sterile surface and slid off, his grip failing. The repair is done, Leo whispered, his voice sounding thin and far away. She's stable. Sit down. He turned, meaning to tell them he was fine, that he had just pushed himself too hard, that he had a history of this and it would pass, but the words caught in his throat. The monitors were screaming, but the sound wasn't coming from the patient. It was coming from him. He looked down and saw, with a strange, detached curiosity, the leads attached to his own chest pulsing in time with the erratic, dying flutter of his own heart. The room roared with the sound of 1,000 rushing trains. He caught a glimpse of Mrs. Gable's face, still under anesthesia, still oblivious to the fact that the boy she had discarded had just pulled her back from the threshold of the grave. As he crumpled to the sterile, unforgiving floor, the last thing he saw was Dr. Eris lunging for the crash cart, his face a mask of sudden, terrifying realization. The light in the room dimmed, not because the lamps had flickered, but because the world was closing its aperture, shrinking down to the size of a single silent beat. Leo felt the cold, hard floor rise up to meet him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't try to get up. He let the silence come. Code Blue, Eris screamed, the sound echoing as if from a great distance. Dr. Vance is down. Clear the room. But Leo was already drifting, the weight of his own heart finally becoming too much to bear. As the frantic compressions began, he wondered if she would ever know, if she would ever wake up and realize that the life she called a bad investment was the only thing that had bought her another day. His eyes drifted shut. The flatline hummed steady and long, a single, unwavering note that sang in the darkness. The sterile air of the surgical intensive care unit usually brought Dr. Leo Vance a sense of calm. It was a place of logic, of predictable inputs and outputs, where the chaotic mess of human existence was distilled into vitals, electrolytes, and hemodynamics. But today, the rhythmic chirp hiss of the ventilators sounded like a taunt. Lying in bed 4, sedated and intubated, was Evelyn Gable. Leo stood at the foot of her bed, his clipboard clutched tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. Even after 20 years, the architecture of her face, the sharp, imperious nose, the thin, tight mouth, was etched into his memory with the permanence of a scar. She was the woman who had walked into the St. Jude's orphanage, looked him over like a dented can of beans, and whispered to the director, "He's a liability. Why would I invest my heart and home in a boy whose own heart is already failing?" She had left. He had stayed. And in the silence of the following years, he had built a fortress of intellect around his fragility, teaching himself anatomy with a fervor that bordered on religious zeal. Dr. Vance? Leo snapped his head toward the voice. It was Sarah, his senior resident, peering at him with a frown. Her blood pressure is trending down. The trauma to her thoracic cavity was significant, and the bleeding is becoming persistent. We're losing the coagulation cascade. Leo looked back at the monitor. The numbers were sliding. He knew with an analytical detachment he had perfected exactly what was happening. Her body was reacting to the trauma, and her reserves, much like his own, were thin. She's hemodynamically unstable, Leo, Sarah pressed, her voice dropping to a concerned whisper. If we don't re-explore the chest cavity, she's going to code within the hour. But, with her age and the current systemic inflammation, the mortality risk of a secondary surgery is high. Leo felt a familiar, sharp pain bloom in his own chest. His heart, scarred by surgeries and defined by the constant thumping reminder of tetralogy of Fallot, protested the stress. He felt the phantom flutter of an arrhythmia, a warning tremor that he suppressed with a deep, controlled breath. Prep the ore, Leo said, his voice clipped and cold. Sir, you heard me, Sarah. We're going back in. I'm not losing this patient on my watch. As the team mobilized around him, the irony clawed at his throat. He had spent his life trying to escape the label she had pinned on him. The boy nobody wanted. He had become the best, a man who held the lives of strangers in his hands, a man who possessed the power to reach into a chest and flick a switch to keep a life humming. And now, the woman who had condemned him to a life of isolation was the one lying on the table, waiting for his mercy. He walked toward the locker room to scrub in, his reflection in the hallway mirror catching him off guard. He looked older than his 24 years. The pallor of his skin and the dark hollow circles under his eyes spoke of a man who was running on fumes. He felt the weight of his own condition, the stiff valve, the thickening myocardium. But he pushed it down. He had to be perfect. If he could save her, he would prove once and for all that he was more than a liability. He would prove that he was the arbiter of her fate. The ore was a sanctuary of blinding white light and brushed steel. Leo stepped up to the table, his hands steady, though his breath was coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Start anesthesia, he commanded. As he stood over Mrs. Gable, he felt a wave of resentment so potent it made his head swim. She looked so small, so diminished. The arrogance that had once radiated from her was gone, replaced by the vulnerability of a broken machine. I am the one holding your life. Teh, he thought, picking up the scalpel. You looked at me and saw nothing worth saving. Now, I am the only thing keeping you from the ground. Incision, he murmured. The surgery was grueling. The scar tissue from her previous trauma was dense, making the dissection difficult and bloody. Leo worked with a feverish, almost desperate intensity. Every minute he spent in her chest was a minute he spent fighting his own body. His legs felt heavy, as if they were made of lead, and the persistent hum of the overhead lights began to pulse in time with the thudding in his ears. Dr. Vance, your vitals are spiking, the anesthesiologist remarked, glancing at Leo's monitor. Are you all right? Focus on the patient, Leo snapped, his hands working with robotic precision. He reached the source of the bleeding. A jagged tear near the aorta that had been masked by a hematoma. It was a surgical nightmare. To repair it, he had to perform a delicate, high-tension suture that required absolute stillness. He held his breath, his vision blurring at the edges. The room seemed to tilt, the horizon line of his focus narrowing to a singular point of blood and tissue. Just a bit more tea, he told himself. Finish it, and you win. He passed the needle through the arterial wall, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He felt a sharp stabbing pain in his own heart, a sensation like a hot needle being driven into his center. He ignored it. He cinched the suture, tied it, and watched as the bleeding slowed, then stopped. She's stabilizing, Sarah said, sounding relieved. Pressure is coming up. Leo, you did it. The sound of the words felt like a distant echo. The pressure in Leo's chest increased, a crushing weight that made it impossible to draw air. He tried to step back from the table to hand off the remaining closure to Sarah, but his knees turned to water. The scalpel clattered to the floor, a sound that seemed to shatter the silence of the room. Leo, the world tilted violently. He felt himself falling, the cold linoleum floor rushing up to meet him. As he hit the ground, the sterile ceiling began to spin, the white lights stretching into long, blinding streaks. He heard the frantic shouts of his team, the chaotic beep of monitors, and a sudden, sharp, rhythmic alarm, a code blue. It's coming from me, T, he realized with a strange, detached curiosity. As his vision began to fade into the dark, he looked up at the table. Evelyn Gable was waking up. Her chest was rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She was alive. She was breathing because of him. The monitors around him screamed in a dissonant, frantic harmony. He felt a hand press against his chest, the rhythmic push of CPR beginning to jar his broken heart. But the sensation felt distant, like someone knocking on a door from miles away. I am not a liability, T, he thought, his pulse stuttering into a chaotic, irregular rhythm. I am the savior, the darkness pressed in, colder and deeper than he had ever known. His own heart, the one he had spent a lifetime studying, the one he had tried to master and mend, gave one final, desperate, agonizing lurch. Clear! Someone screamed, the paddles buzzing with a high-pitched whine. Leo didn't feel the shock. He felt only the sudden, absolute silence of the room as the monitor flatlined into a long, continuous, terrifying tone. We're losing him! Sarah's voice broke through the void, sounding shattered. Push the EP. Come on, Leo. Stay with us. But Leo was already drifting, his eyes fixed on the ceiling light that was slowly being snuffed out by the encroaching black. As his consciousness flickered like a dying bulb, he caught a glimpse of the digital display. Evelyn Gable's heart rate was a steady, beautiful 65 beats per minute. He had won. But as the darkness consumed him, he realized with a terrifying finality that in his race to prove his worth, he had forgotten the one thing he had been fighting to save all along, his own life. The monitors continued to shriek, a discordant symphony of a life hanging by the thinnest of threads. In the center of the OR, the team fell upon him, their faces masks of panic and grief, as the surgeon who had saved the woman nobody wanted succumbed to the very silence he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. Everything went black, save for that single unyielding, flat line that refused to bend. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the intensive care unit was the only sound Leo Vance had known for the past 48 hours. His body felt like a borrowed suit, ill-fitting, heavy, and fraying at the seams. His own heart, a scarred relic of his childhood in St. Jude's, fluttered against his ribs like a trapped bird, a reminder that the marathon he had been running his entire life was nearing its final, jagged mile. He sat in the chair beside bed 4, his hands tucked beneath his thighs to hide the tremors that had persisted since the surgery. Evelyn Gable stirred. It was a slow, agonizing process, the fog of anesthesia receding to reveal the harsh reality of her chest tubes and the steady, rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Her eyelids fluttered, then cracked open, revealing eyes that had once looked at a 10-year-old boy and seen only a bad investment. Leo didn't look away. He didn't offer a rehearsed clinical smile. He simply waited. Where? Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the medical equipment. She tried to lift a hand, but the IV lines tethered her to the bed. Who? You're in the cardiothoracic ICU at St. Jude's, Leo said, his voice steady, anchored by the professional coldness he had spent 2 decades perfecting. You were in a significant collision. Multiple rib fractures, a myocardial contusion, and a pericardial tamponade. We stabilized you. Evelyn focused on him, her brow furrowed, a flicker of recognition passing behind her eyes. Not the recognition of a savior, but of something buried, something uncomfortable. The surgeon? I am Dr. Leo Vance. She searched his face, her gaze lingering on the jagged scar that ran just beneath his collarbone, a roadmap of his own history. She seemed to be trying to place him, her mind grasping at the edges of a memory she had likely discarded as unimportant decades ago. You, she started, then winced, the pain of her injuries pulling her back. You look familiar. Leo stood up. The movement sent a wave of vertigo crashing through him, the room tilting violently for a heartbeat before he stabilized himself against the railing. I was a resident at the orphanage where you volunteered 24 years ago, Mrs. Gable. The boy you looked at and decided wasn't worth the cost of the premiums. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Evelyn's breath hitched, a jagged sound that set off a string of alarms on the monitor. Her heart rate spiked, the yellow lines dancing in a frantic, panicked rhythm. Leo, she breathed, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. The child with the tetralogy? I am the child with the tetralogy, he corrected, his voice devoid of malice, which made it all the more cutting. And I am the surgeon who just spent 6 hours reconstructing your mitral valve. You were a liability then. Today you were a priority. Evelyn went pale. The monitor continued to protest, a high rhythmic chirping that signaled her distress. Her eyes welled with tears, not of gratitude, but of a profound, shattering shame. She looked at the man before her, tall, composed, clearly dying on his feet, yet possessed of a skill she had never imagined he could attain. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was a different person. I was young. I was afraid of the responsibility. We are all afraid of things that might break, Mrs. Gable, Leo said softly. He reached out, his hand hovering over the bedside chart. The difference is that some of us choose to fix what is broken, and others choose to walk away. You walked away. I studied the mechanics of the heart until I understood why you did it, and until I understood why it didn't matter. You saved me, she said, her fingers clutching at the thin hospital blanket. Why? After everything I did, the rejection. Why would you care if I lived? Leo looked at the window, beyond which the city lights blurred into a haze. He felt his own heart skipping beats, long, terrifying pauses that felt like the earth dropping out from beneath him. He was exhausted, a bone-deep, terminal exhaustion. He had spent his life proving to the world, and specifically to her, that he was capable, and now that he had, the silence that followed was deafening. I didn't save you for you, Leo said, turning back to her. I saved you because that is what a surgeon does. We do not choose who deserves to live. We only choose to hold back death, even when it is knocking on our own doors. Evelyn stared at him, the weight of her past judgment colliding with the reality of her survival. She saw the man he had become, the brilliant, tragic figure who had traded his longevity for his legacy. You're hurt, she realized, her voice dropping to a tremor. You're not well. Leo didn't answer. He couldn't. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the room darkening into a soft, velvet black. He felt the familiar, crushing pressure in his chest, the structural failure he had been dancing around for years finally catching up to him. He had pushed his body through the surgery as if it were a weapon, and now the weapon was shattering. Dr. Vance? Evelyn said, her voice rising in panic as she saw him sway. Nurse, get a nurse. Leo reached out to steady himself, but his hands slipped on the smooth metal of the bedside table. The room spun. He saw the face of the young boy he used to be, the one who hid in the closet of the orphanage reading Gray's Anatomy, and for a moment he felt a strange, cold peace. He hadn't been a liability. He had been the instrument of his own salvation. I am a surgeon, he whispered to the fading light. He collapsed forward, his body striking the side of the bed. The impact was heavy and final. The cardiac monitors in the room exploded into a chorus of frantic, discordant alarms. The rhythmic, steady thrum of his own heart, which had guided him through every trial, suddenly tore into a jagged, erratic rhythm before dissolving into a long, flat, unbroken tone. Code Blue! Evelyn screamed, her voice cracking the sterile air of the ICU. Code Blue! Someone help him! The heavy double doors of the unit burst open. Dr. Aris and a team of residents sprinted into the room, their faces etched with shock as they saw their mentor lying motionless on the linoleum floor. Leo, Eris knelt beside him, his fingers searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Get the crash cart, now! Charge to 200! Evelyn watched, paralyzed by the sheer sickening irony of the moment. She was alive because of the man who was now being fought for by the very team he had led. The defibrillator paddles were charged with a sharp, high-pitched whine. Clear, Eris shouted. Leo's body jolted, arching off the floor. The monitors remained flat. Again. As the second shock hit, the emergency lights in the hallway outside flickered, and the entire ICU plunged into a sudden, inexplicable darkness. In the brief, terrified silence that followed, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the medical team in the dark, and the chilling, persistent silence of the machine that was supposed to be measuring the life of the boy nobody wanted. Then from the darkness, a single weak, distorted sound emanated. Not a beep, but a rhythmic thud. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a knock.